In the troops, they called this machine the mass grave for four, or even cruder, the bitch. It had no roof, and the armor was so thin it could be penetrated by a standard machine gun. The crews of these self-propelled guns were considered suicide squads. Any engagement with a heavy German tank was a guaranteed end for them. But in the summer of 1944, in the Belarusian swamps, Lieutenant Volkov decided to rewrite the laws of war. He attempted a trick that bordered on insanity. He didn't fire, even though the enemy was within pistol range. He turned his back to the Germans. He forced 45 tons of lethal German steel to work against itself. What happened next isn't described in any field manual. It wasn't an artillery duel, but a cruel lesson in physics, where mistakes are paid for not with repairs, but with a horrific death in black sludge. Watch to the end to see how a cardboard machine destroyed a steel monster without firing a single shot. Summer, 1944, Belarus, the Bobruisk area, 4 o'clock in the morning. The world had vanished. Only white milk remained, thick as cotton. The morning fog in these swamps isn't a weather phenomenon, it's a tactical factor. Visibility was zero. Optical sights were dead. The Hertz panorama was useless. The glass was covered in an oily film of condensation that had to be wiped away with a quilted jacket sleeve every 30 seconds. The humidity was 100%. The air was heavy. It stuck to the lungs, smelling of rotten mire, decaying pine needles, and the sharp, incomparable scent of burnt diesel and gun grease. It was the smell of war, eaten into the pores of the skin, into the fabric of tunics, into the metal of the breeches. The crew of Guards Lieutenant Viktor Volkov sat inside the Su-76M self-propelled artillery mount. The troops had many names for this machine. The bitch, the barn, the bare-assed Ferdinand. These nicknames weren't insults, but statements of fact, statements of vulnerability. This machine had no roof. The fighting compartment was open to all winds, rains, and shrapnel. The superstructure armor was just 15 millimeters, 1.5 centimeters of steel. That is protection against a rifle bullet fired from 500 meters. Any large fragment, any burst from a German MG-42 machine gun would stitch right through this steel, turning the cabin into a meat grinder. There was no sense of security here, like the thick hide of a heavy tank provides. Here, you sat as if naked in a town square. But the open cabin had one advantage that today, in this cursed fog, was worth more than armor: sound. Tankers in sealed turrets are deaf. They hear only the roar of their own engine and the crackle of the intercom. A self-propelled gunner hears everything. He is part of the acoustic landscape of the forest. Volkov raised a hand clad in a stiff leather glove. The gesture was sharp, chopping. The command: kill the engines. The driver mechanic in the front hull, hunched in his tight hatch, cut the ignition. The twin Gaz-203 engines, howling strenuously at high RPMs, died out. Silence fell. But it wasn't a dead silence. It was a silence filled with microscopic sounds screaming of danger. You could hear the manifold cooling, making a light, metallic ticking sound. You could hear a drop of condensation fall from the breech of the Zis-3 cannon onto the ribbed floor of the fighting compartment. You could hear the heavy, suppressed breathing of the loader, clutching a high-explosive fragmentation shell weighing 6 kilograms and 200 grams to his chest. Volkov closed his eyes. Vision was only a hindrance now. His brain switched to echolocation mode. All information about the world now came through his ears. To the right, a kilometer away, a machine gun was working. The sound was dry, crackling. That was our Maxim. To the left were the dull thuds of 81mm mortar shells. But Volkov wasn't interested in that. He was waiting for a different sound, a sound that meant death. And it came. First, it was just a vibration, the trembling of the earth transmitted through the tracks, through the suspension torsion bars, right into the soles of his boots. The swamp, despite its viscosity, transmitted the low-frequency oscillations of heavy masses perfectly. The earth groaned. Then the sound appeared, a low, womb-like rumble. It was different from the strained whine of Soviet motors. This was German engineering at work. A Maybach HL-230 engine, 23 liters of displacement, 700 horsepower. A steady, powerful, self-assured drone. Mixed into it was a characteristic clanking. German tracks were wider than ours. The track pins knocked differently. It was the sound of heavy metal grinding the earth. Volkov opened his eyes and looked at his men. Their faces were gray, like the fog. The gunner gripped the traverse wheels so hard his knuckles turned white. The loader was moving his lips, but no words were audible. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. It didn't matter. What mattered was the physiology of fear. Adrenaline was dumping into their blood in such quantities that time began to stretch. A second turned into a minute. The heart hammered against the ribs like a blacksmith's sledge. In an open cabin, you feel like a target in a shooting gallery. You know, out there, in the fog, 45 tons of alloyed Krupp steel are moving. A Panther, Type 5. The Panther's frontal armor is 80 millimeters at a rational slope of 55 degrees. The effective armor thickness is almost 140 millimeters. A shell from the ZIS 376mm cannon, even a sub-caliber one, would simply bounce off it from this distance like a pea off a wall. Volkov had no chance in a head-on duel. One hit from a German 75mm shell with high muzzle velocity would tear their light self-propelled gun to pieces. The welds would burst, the ammunition would detonate. The crew wouldn't even have time to realize they were dead. Volkov knew this. He was an engineer by education. Before the war, he built bridges. He thought in vectors, masses, and structural mechanics. He understood. In a direct collision, the kinetic energy of the German shell would turn them into vapor. The force was on the enemy's side. The armor was on the enemy's side. Engine power was on the enemy's side. But Volkov had something the German commander, sitting right now behind thick armor and peering through a narrow vision slit, did not. Volkov had an understanding of inertia. The sound approached. The drone of the Maybach grew louder, filling the entire space, displacing the air. It seemed the fog itself was vibrating. You could hear young birches snapping under the tracks of the steel monster. The crunch of wood sounded like gunshots. The distance was closing. 400 meters. 300. 200. Shapes began to emerge in the milky veil. At first it was just a clot of darkness, denser than the surrounding fog. An angular silhouette. The predatory profile of a turret. The long gun barrel with a muzzle brake that looked like the knob of a cane. The barrel was pointing directly toward their ambush, but the German gunner didn't see them. He was blind. He was simply scanning the sector. Volkov exhaled slowly. His hand reached for the intercom. Heroism wasn't needed now. Cold, cynical calculation was needed. The psychology of the crew had to become an extension of the machine's mechanics. Fear had to become fuel. 45 tons were moving toward them at a speed of 15 kilometers per hour. That is an impulse of immense force. Stopping such mass instantly is impossible. Newton's laws apply equally to everyone, but the Germans relied too much on their invulnerability. They felt like kings of this swamp. They forgot that the bigger the cupboard, the louder it falls, and the deeper it sinks. Volkov looked at the control levers in the driver's hands. All hope now lay not in the cannon. The cannon in this fight was merely an instrument of provocation. The main weapons were the clutches, the gearbox, and the viscous, treacherous soil of the Belarusian swamp. The roar rose to a crescendo. It seemed the panther would emerge from the fog right under their noses any second, crushing the brush. Nerves were at the limit. The loader lowered a shell into the breech. The clang of the bolt sounded like a sentence in this cottony silence. But Volkov shook his head. Too early. Still too early.
Let him get closer.
The German commander needed to believe in his impunity. He needed to see the prey. Here, in the wet forest, it wasn't a battle starting. It was a chess match, where the pieces were multi-ton machines, and the board was shifting ground, ready to swallow anyone who miscalculated. The inertia was already cocked like a hammer. All that remained was to pull the trigger. Lieutenant Volkov looked at the inside of the cabin's armor plate. 15 millimeters, 1.5 centimeters of rolled steel. This wasn't protection. It was an illusion, a psychological placebo for the crew, so they wouldn't go mad with terror. Any German armor-piercing shell of 75 millimeter caliber, fired from the Panther's long-barreled gun, wouldn't even notice this obstacle. It would stitch through the front plate, fly through the fighting compartment, turning men and mechanisms into bloody mince, and exit through the rear without even arming the fuse. The kinetic energy of the German slug would be enough to punch through 2 such self-propelled guns, placed one behind the other. Volkov knew this arithmetic by heart. It was the mathematics of suicide. In this morning fog, a meeting of 2 different eras, 2 different philosophies of war was taking place. On one side, the German heavy tank Panther, the pinnacle of Teutonic engineering genius. 45 tons of weight, frontal armor of 80 millimeters set at a 55-degree angle. This means that for a horizontally flying projectile, the thickness of the metal is almost 140 millimeters. The German KWK-42 cannon accelerates a shell to 1,000 meters per second. It is a 75 millimeter sniper rifle. Accurate, deadly, expensive. On the other side, the Soviet Su-76M. 11 tons, 4 times lighter, a welded box mounted on the lengthened chassis of a T-70 light tank. Engines. A pair of automotive gas motors, originally intended for light trucks and passenger cars, not for war. The armor protected only against bullets and small shrapnel. There was no roof. If a German high-explosive shell burst in the treetops overhead, the crew would die from the shockwave and shrapnel falling from above. This was an infantry support vehicle, a surrogate that had to be mass-produced and rushed to the front to plug holes in the defense. In the troops, they said of it, a communal grave for 4. The loader, Private Petrov, just a boy, sat on the ammo crate. His lips moved soundlessly. He wasn't looking at the instruments. He was staring into nothingness. In his hands was a heavy casing. His fingers were white from tension. The driver mechanic, Grigoriev, gripped the clutch control levers. His back, covered in an oil-soaked jumpsuit, trembled slightly. This wasn't cowardice. This was the organism's reaction to understanding the inevitable. When 45 tons of steel are coming at you, the instinct for self-preservation screams only one thing: run. Jump out of this iron box and burrow into the moss. Volkov, in a harsh, commanding manner, suppressed this impulse in himself and his men. Belay the panic. His voice sounded dry, like the crack of a breaking branch. Grigoriev, keep your foot on the brake. Don't burn the clutch. Listen only to me. For Volkov, the battlefield wasn't a place for heroism or fear. It was a drawing board. He didn't see a monster with crosses on its armor, but a vector diagram. Mass, velocity, inertia, the coefficient of friction of tracks on viscous soil. He understood. To enter a firefight now meant dying in 3 seconds. The Panther had the advantage in armor and firepower, but it had one fatal flaw arising from its very strengths: its weight. 45 tons of inertial mass. Accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour, the German tank possessed the kinetic energy of a railway locomotive. To stop such a behemoth required hundreds of meters of braking distance, or a concrete wall, or a swamp that forgives no mistakes with weight. The Su-76 weighed only 11 tons. It had wide tracks. Its ground pressure was less than that of a human foot. It could pass where a man would sink to his waist. It was nimble. It stopped almost instantly because the inertia of its mass was low. In this fight, its armor wasn't steel. Its armor was dynamics and physics. "Comrade Lieutenant, he's going to..." The gunner's voice broke into a falsetto. "Silence," Volkov cut him off. "He doesn't see us. We are void to him." Volkov looked at the breech of the ZIS-3 gun. An excellent cannon, divisional, reliable, but against the Panther's forehead, it was powerless. The spool subcaliber shell could penetrate the German only from 300 meters, and only if lucky enough to hit the flat part of the gun mantlet. The chance was 1 in 100. The risk was 100 out of 100. Therefore, Volkov did not intend to shoot. Not now. A shot is a flash. A flash in the fog is a spotlight indicating, "I am here, kill me." Volkov's plan was insane from the standpoint of the manual, but flawless from the standpoint of mechanics. He didn't intend to pierce the Panther's armor. He intended to use its own energy against it. The principle of judo, or aikido: use the opponent's force to destroy him. Let 45 tons of German metal bury themselves. The sound of the Maybach engine became deafening. Low-frequency vibration resonated in their teeth. It felt as if the air in the cabin had thickened. Volkov saw a drop of sweat run down the driver's temple and fall onto the left clutch lever. "Get ready," Volkov whispered. "First gear." "Hold the RPMs. Wait." They sat in their open-topped tin can like condemned men awaiting execution. But the judge here wasn't the German tanker. The judge here was Sir Isaac Newton. And Volkov knew this judge's laws better than anyone in this forest. The logic was simple. A heavy tank is inertial. Its turret rotates slowly. The electric drive can't keep up with sharp movements of the target. The commander's field of view is limited by vision slits and periscopes. In the fog, he is almost blind. He relies on the power of his armor and the enemy's fear. He is sure the Russian plywood will run away or shoot in panic. He doesn't expect the Russian plywood to close in on its own, to play cat and mouse on the edge of a bottomless quagmire. "Loader, armor piercing," Volkov commanded without turning his head. "Gunner, sights at 0. Observation sector, straight ahead." The clang of the breech sounded unnaturally loud. The shell was in the barrel. There was no way back. Now their lives depended not on the thickness of armor plates, but on whether the transmission could withstand a sharp jerk, and whether the temperamental engines would stall at the most inopportune moment. A surgeon's instrument in the hands of a butcher. That is, a self-propelled gun in urban combat. But here, in the swamps, it was a scalpel needed to lance the abscess of the German defense. One wrong move, and the scalpel would break. Volkov looked at his watch. The second hand moved in jerks. Tick, tick, tick. Time compressed. Consciousness cleared of everything superfluous. There was no fear of death. There was only trajectory calculation, assessment of soil viscosity, and waiting for the moment when the enemy's silhouette became clear enough to begin this deadly race. A race where the prize was life, and the penalty for a mistake was instant transformation into a burning torch. The fog tore open suddenly, as if someone had yanked a dirty curtain. Right in front of them, the distance was pistol range, 20, maybe 25 meters. In the sight eyepiece, there wasn't just a silhouette, but a wall of metal covered in zimmerit, a ribbed anti-magnetic coating looking like a hardened washboard. The Panther stood, listing slightly forward. Huge. Predatory. It filled the whole world. You could see every scratch on the gun mantlet, every bolt on the drive sprocket, clumps of greasy clay stuck between the tracks. The muzzle brake of the cannon looked slightly to the side, into the void they had occupied a second ago. This was the moment of absolute truth. The moment when time stops and the heart skips a beat. Face to face. A light, almost cardboard, self-propelled gun against a heavy breakthrough tank. A weight category of fly against elephant. Gunner Seragin flinched. His hand instinctively squeezed the trigger. The barrel of the ZIS-3 pointed straight at the junction of the German's turret and hull. The perfect target. A killing position. The scream stuck in his throat. Fire! It was a reflex. It was animal fear demanding immediate action. Strike first to survive. Belay that! Volkov's voice lashed like a slap in the face. Don't shoot! Inside the cabin, it sounded like madness. Don't shoot? When the enemy is 20 meters away? When you are looking into the black muzzle of his gun? But Volkov was right. He was the only one in this hell keeping the cold head of an engineer. A shot from this distance would be a mistake. The slug would hit the armor, of course, maybe even knock off a track or jam the turret, but it wouldn't kill the beast. The Panther's frontal armor would hold. However, the muzzle flash in this thick, moisture-saturated air would instantly blind his own crew. Powder gases would create an impenetrable cloud in front of the cabin. They would lose orientation. But the German would not. Furthermore, a shot is a period. It is the end of the dialogue, and Volkov needed an ellipsis. He needed a provocation. He needed not just to damage the tank, but to force it to move, to force it to make a mistake. In the German machine, there was shock too. They didn't expect to see Russians so close. They were looking for anti-tank guns in the bushes and stumbled upon a brazen, self-propelled gun right in the middle of the trail. The Panther's turret began to turn. Slowly, agonizingly slowly. The hydraulics hummed, trying to rotate the multi-ton mass with its long barrel. 75 millimeters of death crawled toward the cabin of the Su-76. At such a short distance, the angular velocity of the target is huge. The German gunner spun his hand wheels. His hands must have been flying, but you can't cheat physics. The turret's inertia worked against him. The barrel was lagging. It couldn't keep up with the moment. Volkov saw the driver's pupils dilate. Grigoriev watched the turning turret like a rabbit watches a python. Another second, and the barrel would look them right in the face. And then, the end. A high-explosive shell would tear them to shreds. "Back!" Volkov screamed, overpowering the roar of blood in his ears. "Full reverse! To the causeway! Go, son, floor it!" Grigoriev snapped out of it. His hands remembered the muscle memory. His left foot depressed the clutch. His right hand slammed the reverse lever in with a crunch. Gas to the floor. The Gaz-203 engines howled at the limit of their RPMs. This howl wasn't a song. It was a death rattle. The transmission took a monstrous blow. Drive shafts twisted, ready to snap. The tracks bit into the shifting soil, throwing fountains of mud forward, toward the German. The light 11-ton machine jerked like it was stung and jumped back. This wasn't the smooth movement of a tank. It was the lunge of a frightened beast. The Su-76, clanking its tracks, backed into the fog, into the saving gray gloom. The German commander in the cupola saw this flight. He saw fear. He saw easy prey that, having snarled its presence, was trying to escape unpunished. The hunter's psychology triggered instantly. Predator instinct overrode regulation caution. The Russians are running. They are in panic. Finish them. Crush them. Vorwärts! The command rang in the German headset. Forward! The Panther's turret stopped its useless rotation. Why turn your head if you can turn the whole body? Why aim if you can just catch up and shoot point blank into the thin rear of the fleeing tin can? Or simply run it over with the tracks, turning it into a pancake along with the crew? Volkov heard the tonality of the German engine change. The steady drone was replaced by an aggressive roar. RPMs rose. The clanking of tracks accelerated. The fish took the bait. The lure worked. The 45-ton boulder shifted from its place and began to accelerate. Don't speed, Volkov commanded, holding onto the handrail to keep from flying out of the cabin on the bumps. Keep distance. Tease him. Show him your ass, Grigoriev. Let him think we've crapped our pants. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. A game of cat and mouse on the edge of a cliff. If Grigoriev drove too fast, the German would lose them in the fog and stop. If he drove too slowly, they'd get a shell in the engine compartment. They had to balance on a razor's edge. Be visible, but unreachable. Be pathetic, but fast. The Su-76 backed down the narrow causeway, the only solid path amidst the bottomless swamp. To the left was quagmire, to the right was marsh. One wrong move with the lever, and a track would slip into the sludge. Then the end. The machine would belly out, and the German would shoot them like targets on a range. Grigoriev drove the machine looking in the rearview mirror and listening to the commander's orders. His face was drenched in sweat, a mixture of oil and salty moisture. His hands shook, but did their job. Left! More left! Volkov yelled. Hold the track! From behind, out of the fog, the Panther burst forth. It was gathering speed. It wasn't just driving anymore. It was rushing. The driver of the heavy tank felt the power under his feet. He was confident. Bushes and small trees snapped under his tracks. He saw before him only the narrow back of the scurrying Soviet self-propelled gun. He had tunnel vision. He wasn't looking at the ground. He wasn't looking to the sides. He looked only at the target. The rage and thrill of the chase shut off caution. The German driver pressed the gas, accelerating 45 tons of death to 30-40 kilometers per hour. Inertia grew geometrically. Kinetic energy accumulated, turning the tank into an unguided projectile. Volkov watched the approaching hulk. The distance was shrinking. 50 meters. 40. 30. He saw the Panther's long guns swaying, trying to catch them in the sights on the move. The German wouldn't shoot on the move. The risk of missing on the bumps was too high, and shells had to be conserved. He wanted to get right up close, to be sure. Punch it, Grigoriev, punch it! Volkov whispered. Now the most terrifying part would begin. A death race where the finish line was a turn the German couldn't see, a turn beyond which lay emptiness. The self-propelled gun roared, bouncing on roots. Inside the cabin, everything was shaking. Shell casings rolled on the floor, ringing like funeral bells. Petrov, the loader, gripped the breech, eyes closed. He was just a body, ballast waiting for his fate. And behind them, inevitable as an avalanche, the steel wave rolled on. The German tank had already accelerated so much that not even God himself could stop it instantly. Physics had come into its own. The trap had snapped shut, though the beast still thought it was the hunter. The race was on. This wasn't a sports heat on a track. It was a duel of two engines, two transmissions, and two nervous systems. In the forest near Bobruisk, where the air was saturated with moisture and the smell of rot, a scenario was unfolding that wasn't written in any combat manual of the Wehrmacht or the Red Army. Inside the Panther, the atmosphere changed instantly. Cold German methodicalness burned up in the furnace of the hunting thrill. The tank commander saw through his Zeiss sight the open fighting compartment of the Soviet gun. He saw the crew's backs. He saw the unprotected rear, where fuel tanks hid behind a thin sheet of steel. This wasn't an opponent. This was a victim. A victim that had made a fatal error by getting too close and was now trying to flee in panic. The command in the German crew's headsets was short and harsh. The driver mashed the accelerator pedal to the floor. The 700 horsepower Maybach responded with a low, vibrating roar. 12 cylinders, 23 liters of displacement, devoured high-octane gasoline, turning chemical energy into monstrous mechanical power. 45 tons of alloy steel tore off the mark. For the German driver, this was a moment of machine triumph. He felt the multi-ton behemoth react obediently. Tracks 660 millimeters wide bit into the soil, throwing mud. The tank gained speed, 10 kilometers per hour, 20, 30. The Panther was created for open spaces, for the steppes of Ukraine or the fields of France, where it could realize its advantage in ballistics and armor. But here, in a narrow corridor amidst swamps, it turned into a battering ram. It didn't need to shoot. It just needed to catch up. A strike with 45 tons of mass at 30 kilometers per hour would shatter the 11-ton Su-76 into splinters. Just crumple it like a tin can. Ahead, some 40 meters away, the Soviet self-propelled gun darted. Volkov felt this pursuit with his spinal cord. He didn't see the instruments. He felt the machine with his whole body. Every hit of the suspension, every groan of metal transmitted directly to him. They were moving along the log road. It was an old, forgotten timber road, laid with logs that had long since sunk under moss and water. A solid strip just 3.5 meters wide. To the left, black, oily water covered in duckweed. To the right, quaking bog, where stunted birches grew straight out of the rotten slime. A step left, a step right, and the track would slip off. The machine would belly out, and the swamp would suck it down in minutes. Driver-mechanic Grigoriev was performing the impossible. He drove the machine at the limit of traction. The pair of Gaz 203 engines worked to the breaking point. Tachometer needles lay in the red zone. The howl of motors in the open cabin was such that it seemed eardrums would burst. The vibration was such that teeth clattered against each other. The Su-76 is a light machine with a high center of gravity. On every bump it was tossed up. The crew was thrown side to side. Loader Petrov gripped the ammo rack brackets with a death grip. If he fell, he could be pulled under the gun breech, which was bucking wildly in this ride. Volkov, standing in the cabin, held the handrail and looked back over the armor shield. The fog was tearing into shreds from the vortex air currents created by the two machines. The Panther's forehead emerged from the gray veil. It grew before their eyes. It was faster. On paper, the Panther could reach 46 kilometers per hour on a highway. The Su-76 44. On soil, the difference leveled out, but the Germans' acceleration inertia was more powerful. "Push it, Grisha, push it!" Volkov shouted, though he knew Grigoriev couldn't hear him. It was a race with death in its purest form. There was no place for fire tactics here. Only movement mechanics worked here. The Soviet guns' drive shafts, made from automotive parts, experienced extreme torsional loads. Suspension torsion bars groaned, taking hits from logs hidden underwater. One rotten log, one dip, and they would stop. And behind them rolled a steel wave that didn't know how to brake. The German commander had fallen into a state medics called tunnel vision. The whole world had narrowed for him to the size of the fleeing rear of the Soviet machine. He didn't look at the trees flashing by on the sides. He didn't notice the color of the moss changing under the tracks, from green to rusty brown, indicating the proximity of deep bog. He saw only the target. The thrill of the chase shut off the self-preservation instinct. He felt like the king of this forest, that his armor would protect him from everything. He forgot about inertia. 45 tons of accelerated steel is colossal energy. Kinetic energy equals half the mass times the square of velocity. The faster he drove, the more terrifying his tank became. But this same force made him a hostage of his own speed. The tank became a projectile flying along a trajectory. Controlling such a projectile on a slippery log road is an illusion of control. The distance shrank to 20 meters. Volkov saw tongues of blue flame bursting from the Panther's exhaust pipes, the overly rich mixture burning in the manifolds. The German was squeezing every drop out of the engine. He was already anticipating the impact. He saw the rear of the bitch bounce, how it wagged its tail trying to stay on the slippery logs. The earth shook. This was not a metaphor. The swampy soil worked like a membrane, transmitting the impacts of the heavy tank's tracks for hundreds of meters around. Water in puddles rippled. Pine needles rained down from branches. Birds had long since flown away, frightened by this infernal rumble. Volkov looked forward. There, ahead, the fog was becoming denser. There, behind the wall of white milk, was the point of no return. A sharp 90-degree turn of the causeway, the only path to salvation. But to enter it, one had to do something that contradicted the survival instinct. The German didn't see this turn. For him, the road was straight. For him, the chase was a straight line. He was sure the Russians were just running in a straight line, saving their skins. This confidence was his sentence. "Prepare for maneuver!" Volkov yelled, straining his voice. He knew. The climax was coming now. Physics would present its bill. All the accumulated kinetic energy of the German tank, all the power of its 700 horses, all the fury of its 45 tons of weight. All of this had to work against it. The self-propelled gun flew over the logs, splashing mud. Speed, maximum for these conditions, 35 kilometers per hour. It seemed the machine was about to fall apart into bolts and nuts, but it held. Soviet steel, rough, messy, but durable, took the beating. Volkov counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The landmark was a broken pine to the left. As soon as they pulled level with it, they would have to pull the emergency brake. From behind, the screech of metal was already audible. The Panther's tracks were scratching the ground very close. The German was sure the prize was in his pocket. He didn't even try to fire the machine gun. Why spoil a trophy that can simply be crushed and pushed into the swamp? The race was entering the home stretch. Only the finish tape here wasn't a strip of fabric, but the border between solid ground and bottomless quagmire. And only one was destined to cross this border. The heart pounded in his temples so hard, the rhythm drowned out the transmission whine. The roar of blood. Tick, tick, tick. Lieutenant Volkov didn't look at his watch. In battle, a dial is useless. In battle, time is measured not in seconds, but in piston strokes and meters devoured by tracks. 100 meters remained to the saving, yet deadly dangerous turn. Ahead, through breaks in the fog, a false landmark began to emerge. It was a clearing, flat, covered in tender emerald green grass dusted with morning dew. On the general staff map, solid ground was marked here. But maps lie. Topographers drew them from airplanes without descending into this rotten sludge. Volkov had walked here on foot 2 days ago. He knew. This beautiful clearing was a classic swamp lens. On top, a thin carpet of woven roots and moss, sod just 20 centimeters thick. And underneath, 3 meters of liquid peat, a black abyss that had no bottom. It was the perfect trap. Nature created it 1,000 years ago, and Volkov decided to use it this morning. The log road they were rushing along made a sharp, unnatural break to the left, a turn at a right angle. 90 degrees. For tracked vehicles, such a maneuver at speed was almost a guaranteed thrown track. If a track jumped off the drive sprocket, the machine would instantly lose control, spin across the road, and be thrown into the ditch, into the very mire they were trying to escape. But there was no other way out. Either risk the suspension or take a 75mm shell in the rear. The sound from behind reached its peak. It wasn't just engine roar anymore. It was physical pressure. The sound wave from the Maybach hit the back of the head like a blunt, heavy object. The German Panther hung on their tail like it was glued. The distance had shrunk to 15 meters. In the rearview mirror, Grigoriev saw only the huge, sloped plate of frontal armor and the muzzle brake dancing up and down in time with the bumps. The German commander triumphed. He saw panic flight before him. He saw the Russian gun rushing straight toward the flat clearing. For him, the battle picture was crystal clear. The Russians lost orientation in the fog and were breaking out into open space to try to gain speed or turn around. He didn't know about the turn. The log road was hidden under a layer of mud and water. It blended with the landscape. For the German, only the target's motion vector existed, and that vector led straight to the center of the green lawn. Volkov felt the vibration with his entire skeleton. 45 tons of steel rushing behind created an earthquake effect. The inertia of this mass was monstrous. If the Panther slammed into them now, it wouldn't even feel the impact. It would simply run over the 11-ton Su-76, flatten it into a pancake, mixing metal with the crew's bones, and drive on. The kinetic energy of the German tank was now equal to the energy of an express train. Stopping this instantly was impossible. Physics is relentless. The braking distance of such mass on slippery ground would be tens of meters. The cabin smelled of ozone and overheated metal. Loader Petrov sat head tucked into his shoulders. He felt that stare in his back, the stare of the black muzzle of the German gun. He knew the rear armor was just 15 millimeters. That's not even armor. It's a coffin lid. Any machine gun burst would stitch them through now. But the German wasn't shooting. He wanted to crush. He wanted to feel the crunch. It was sadism born of a sense of absolute superiority. "Hold on," Volkov whispered, clutching the handrail so hard the leather on his gloves creaked. "Just a bit more. Another couple of seconds." He was playing with fire. If they started braking too early, the German would see the maneuver and have time to react. He would also slam the brakes or turn the hull. If they started too late, inertia would carry them into the swamp themselves, and then they would become an easy target, floundering in the mud. Perfect timing was needed. Timing calculated not by clocks, but by a predator's instinct. 50 meters to the turn. Speed 35 kilometers per hour. For the Su-76 on such ground, this was the aerodynamic limit of a brick. The machine shook so hard vision doubled. It seemed the bolts holding the armor plates would fly out of their grooves any moment. 40 meters. The German behind added gas. He decided it was time to end this race. The roar of the Maybach turned into a scream. The Panther lunged, trying to reach the rear of the self-propelled gun with its front plate. The distance shrank to 10 meters. Rivets on the German armor were already visible. Mud on the Bosch headlight was visible. It was almost contact. 30 meters. Volkov saw the landmark, a crooked birch with stripped bark standing at the very corner of the turn. This was the point of no return. Beyond it, life or death. The crew froze. Grigoriev wasn't breathing. His foot hovered over the brake pedal. His hand lay on the left clutch lever, ready to yank it back to the stop. Muscles were cramped with tension. He waited for the command. One short command that would trigger a chain reaction of mechanics. 20 meters. The fog before them thinned, revealing that treacherous clearing in all its glory. It looked like a runway, flat, inviting. The German driver saw it and instinctively relaxed. He thought, "This is it. Now we've got them." He didn't see that the solid road veered sharply left into the thick undergrowth. He saw only a straight space for attack. His foot continued to press the accelerator. The inertia of 45 tons of steel, multiplied by the square of velocity, reached critical values. This impulse could no longer be dampened. It was charged. It demanded release. 10 meters. Volkov drew air into his lungs. Time stretched into a thin, ringing string. Now it would snap. Now physics would deliver its verdict. In this moment, there was no war, no ideology, no ranks. There was only mass, velocity, coefficient of friction, and force vector. And a man who decided to cheat the laws of nature, betting 4 lives against 45 tons of death. "No!" Volkov's scream overpowered the roar of the engines. It wasn't a command. It was a trigger. Grigoriev didn't think. There was no time to think. His body worked faster than the impulse traveled from brain to muscle. It was a reflex hammered into the subcortex by thousands of hours of marches, proving grounds, and repairs under freezing rain. The driver's left hand, with force enough to crack joints, ripped the left steering clutch lever back toward himself. To the limit. To the metal stop. Simultaneously, his left foot slammed the left brake pedal with all his might. Inside the transmission, violence against metal occurred. The main clutch was still transmitting torque from the roaring engines, but the left final drive was instantly cut off. The steel brake band, covered in ferrodo, a special heat-resistant material, wrapped around the brake drum like a python. It bit into the spinning metal, grinding to dust, heating to hundreds of degrees. A screech. It wasn't a sound, it was physical pain for the ears. The wild, piercing shriek of brake bands drowned out even the roar of the German Maybach. It was the scream of mechanics working at the limit of material strength. The left track of the Su-76M locked dead. It turned into an anchor. The track links, each weighing several kilograms, dug into the soft soil, tearing roots, moss, and clay. They stopped, but the machine did not. The right track continued to spin, driven by the full power of the twin Gaz-203 engines. What happened is what physics calls the creation of torque. 11 tons of mass flying at 35 kilometers per hour suddenly received a pivot point on the left side. The kinetic energy that was just pushing the machine forward now spun it around the locked track. The hull of the gun was thrown to the side with such force as if an invisible giant hammer had struck it from the side. This wasn't a smooth turn. It was a J-turn, performed on heavy tracked machinery in swamp conditions. The men in the open cabin were thrown to the right. Centrifugal force was merciless. Gunner Saragan was plastered shoulder first into the gun breech. Loader Petrov flew to the right side, banging his helmet against the armor plate. Volkov, anticipating this impact, hung on the handrail, his muscles cracking from strain, keeping his body from flying overboard. If he hadn't held on, he would have been thrown out of the cabin, right under the tracks of the oncoming Panther. The gun spun. The world around smeared into a gray-green blur. Trees, bushes, fog, everything merged into a carousel. Earth flew in clods into the cabin, plastering sights, faces, jumpsuits. The degree of the turn grew. 30, 60, 90. The machine stood across the causeway, nose pointing straight into the thicket, into the saving gap between trees that Volkov had spotted a minute ago. The rear, where the thin armor and fuel tanks were, moved out of the line of fire. "Stop!" rasped Volkov, though no one heard him. Grigoriev felt the moment. He released the brake and depressed the main clutch, severing the engine's link to the tracks. The machine dipped its nose, suspension compressing to the limit, torsion bars groaning, dampening the residual inertia. The self-propelled gun froze. It stood on the very edge of solid ground. Immediately behind its rear began that treacherous clearing. The swamp lens covered in emerald grass. A thick, acrid smell filled the cabin. It smelled of burnt asbestos brake linings. The smell was sharp, chemical. It clawed at the throat. Blue smoke rose from the transmission compartment. The brake drums glowed red hot. If you splashed water on them now, they would explode in steam. But the machine held together. Soviet steel, which the Germans contemptuously called crude, withstood an overload that would have torn apart more complex and delicate machinery. In this moment, the main thing happened: the separation of vectors. The motion vector of the Su-76 was broken at a 90-degree angle. It left the trajectory. But the motion vector of the German Panther remained the same. Inertia is the most stubborn phenomenon in the universe. Newton's first law states, "An object continues in its state of uniform motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an external force." No external forces were acting on the Panther yet. It was too heavy. Volkov, breathing heavily, turned his head to the left. He looked where their rear had just been. Through the thinning fog, a black shadow rushed past. It was the Panther. It flew past them just 2 meters away. Close. So close that the airwave pushed by the 45-ton behemoth hit their faces like a hot wind. The German driver didn't have time to react. Human reaction time is roughly 1 second. The mechanical actuators of a heavy tank add another second of delay. And the inertia of 45 tons makes any attempt at an instant maneuver meaningless. The German saw the Russian gun suddenly, defying all logic, brake and jump sideways into the bushes. To him, it looked like magic. One moment the target was in the sights, and suddenly, emptiness. Before him opened that flat, beautiful clearing. The runway. He was still pressing the gas. His foot simply hadn't had time to leave the pedal. The brain was still processing the target's disappearance, but the machine was already rushing into the trap. The thunder of German tracks was deafening. The ground under the Su-76 shuddered as the steel monster tore past. You could see the huge road wheels of the Panther spinning, arranged in an overlapping pattern. You could see the suspension strained. You could see the mud-splattered hull cross. Volkov saw the face of the German commander in the cupola.
He had turned his head. For a split second, their eyes met. In the German's eyes, there was no fear. There was bewilderment. He didn't understand why the Russians stopped. He didn't understand why they yielded the road. He thought he had won, that the Russians simply chickened out and turned into the ditch. He didn't know yet that he was already dead.
The Su-76 stood, rocking slightly on its springs. The engines idled, making an uneven thug-thug-thug sound. This sound seemed like silence compared to the hell that had been happening a second ago. The crew was coming to their senses. Saragin wiped blood from a split lip. He'd hit the site. Petrov got up from the floor, feeling his side. Grigoriev sat motionless, his hands still gripping the levers, fingers cramped so tight they would have to be pried open by force. "Alive?" Volkov's voice sounded hollow, as if from a barrel. "Yes, sir," rasped Saragin. "Transmission?" Volkov asked, looking at the smoke from the hatch. "Seems intact, Comrade Lieutenant. Just stinks like hell," Grigoriev answered without turning around. Volkov nodded. The emergency brake maneuver was executed. They had stopped 11 tons on a dime, using brute friction force and the durability of Soviet metal. They had cheated death, letting it pass them by. Now all that remained was to watch physics finish what tactics began. The German tank flew out into the middle of the clearing. Its speed was about 40 kilometers per hour. It was magnificent in its power. Predatory, deadly, invincible. The pinnacle of Third Reich technical thought. But under its tracks was no longer the old log road. Under its tracks was a thin layer of sod hiding the abyss. The Panther's ground pressure was almost 0.9 kilograms per square centimeter. That is a lot. Too much for a Belarusian swamp. For the Su-76, this figure was just 0.5, half as much. It was this difference in numbers, boring numbers from technical manuals, that was now deciding who would live and who would die. Volkov took out a cigarette, kneading the mouthpiece with dirty fingers. He didn't light it. He waited for the sound. The sound that would announce the triumph of gravity over engineering genius. The noise of the German engine began to change. The roar turned into a strained whine, and the speed of movement dropped sharply. It wasn't braking. It was viscosity. The medium had begun to resist the intrusion of the foreign body. "Watch," Volkov said quietly. "Now the physics lesson begins. Today's topic, the influence of mass on submersion in a viscous fluid." Grigoriev turned his head. The crew looked at the enemy's back. There, 30 meters away, the huge machine began its final maneuver. The maneuver of submersion. It didn't happen instantly, like in movies. It happened terrifyingly, inevitably, and slowly, like in a nightmare where you want to run but your legs get stuck in cotton. Inertia dragged the Panther to the middle of the lens. Now inertia was over. Statics began. And gravity. Volkov clicked his lighter. The flame trembled. His hands were shaking after all. Adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold emptiness and tremors. But his mind was clear. He was an engineer. He had calculated everything correctly. The Su-76 wasn't a tank. It was a tool. And today, that tool worked flawlessly. All that remained was to document the result. Inside the Panther, time flowed differently. For the German tank crew, the world was now limited to the narrow frames of vision blocks and the sight. They lived in a capsule of alloy steel, separated from reality by 80 millimeters of armor. This isolation, granting a sense of invulnerability, was now playing a cruel joke on them. It deprived them of context. Hans, the Panther's driver, was an experienced soldier. He had been through Kursk. He knew how the machine behaved on solid ground. But he didn't see what Volkov saw. He didn't see that the runway before him was a mirage. When the Russian gun sharply veered left, disappearing into the bushes, Hans experienced a second of confusion. The target vanished. The attack vector hit emptiness. His brain, tuned for the chase, didn't have time to switch gears. His foot still pressed the accelerator pedal, sending rich mixture into the engine. 45 tons of metal flew another 20 meters by inertia. That was just 2 seconds of time. But in those 2 seconds, the tank finally left the solid causeway. The tracks left the rotten but still weight-bearing logs of the corduroy road and flew onto that very emerald carpet. At that moment, physics changed the rules of the game. The coefficient of friction of steel tracks on the ground dropped catastrophically. If on the logs it was 0.7, then on the wet moss, under which lay slime, it trended toward 0.2. It was like driving onto sheer ice on summer tires. Hans finally realized something was wrong. The tank stopped obeying the helm. He felt a strange softness in the ride. The vibration from the logs vanished. The machine was floating. Instinct screamed of danger. Reaction kicked in. He slammed the brakes with both feet. This was a fatal mistake. On a solid road, emergency braking would have stopped the machine, albeit with a skid. But here, on the shifting surface, locking the tracks led to loss of control. The tracks stopped spinning, but the tank didn't stop. It turned into a giant steel sled. The kinetic energy accumulated in 45 tons of mass, accelerated to 40 kilometers per hour, hadn't gone anywhere. It had to go somewhere. According to the law of conservation of energy, it had to convert into friction heat or deformation. But there was no friction. The moss worked like a lubricant. The tank slid. It carried forward with the same speed. Hans frantically turned the steering wheel, trying to straighten the machine, but the Panther didn't respond. It had become a ballistic projectile. The link between the driver and the ground was severed. Now only inertia steered the tank. The machine began to spin. The rear, heavier due to the engine, tried to overtake the nose. The tank went sideways, piling up a wave of mud, sod, and small brush before it. This wave grew, but it couldn't stop the avalanche of steel. From the observer's point of view, it looked terrifying. A huge, angular carcass, engine roaring, which Hans had forgotten to shut off in panic, rushed sideways across the clearing, plowing the earth. It was uncontrollable. It was doomed. Inside the fighting compartment, the crew was tossed like dolls. The tank commander flew out of his seat and hit his shoulder on the gun breech. The loader fell to the floor, bruising his legs on the shell racks. Shouts in the intercom were drowned out by grinding. And then the sod ended. The thin layer of woven roots that created the illusion of solid ground couldn't withstand the dynamic load. It tore with a loud, sucking sound, like the sigh of a giant animal. The tank's nose dipped sharply. The earth under the front rollers simply vanished. The Panther, with full momentum, at a speed of about 20 kilometers per hour, slammed into the opened slime. An impact of monstrous force. It wasn't an impact against a wall. It was an impact against a viscous medium. Liquid is incompressible. The swamp took the hit, dampening speed almost instantly. Deceleration G-force reached several units. The men inside were plastered into the front armor plates. Hans smashed his face on the vision block. The radio man broke his wrist on the machine gun mount. The inertia of the rear hull tried to flip the tank over its nose. The rear flew up, exposing the belly, but the machine's mass was too great for a full somersault. The tank, heavily, with a dull groan, settled back down. The long barrel of the 75mm cannon, the pride of German artillery, stuck into the swamp like a spear. It went into the mud right up to the mantlet. The muzzle brake scooped up peat, plugging the barrel bore tight. Now it wasn't a weapon. It was just an expensive steel pipe packed with mud. The Maybach engine choked. The cooling system clogged with mire instantly. The fans drove a slurry of water and peat into the engine compartment instead of air. The engine sneezed, backfired into the muffler, and died. Silence fell. It descended all at once, deafening after the roar and grinding. Just a moment ago, locomotive energy raged here, and now, dead statics. The Panther froze. It stood listing forward at a 30-degree angle. The tracks were half submerged in the slime. But this was only the beginning. Statics in a swamp is a deceptive thing. Ground pressure began its destructive work. 900 grams per square centimeter. That is too much. The soil under the tank couldn't hold such weight. It flowed. The tank began to sink. Slowly, barely noticeably to the eye, but inevitably. Inside the tank, panic turned to shock. The crew was concussed by the impact. Ears rang. The air smelled of blood and gasoline. They didn't realize yet that the battle was over. They thought they were just stuck. They didn't know yet that this swamp didn't release its prisoners. Hans tried to start the engine. The starter whined, turning the crankshaft, but there was no ignition. The exhaust pipes were already underwater. Gases had nowhere to go. The engine was dead. The tank commander, coming to his senses, tried to assess the situation. He looked into the periscope, but the periscopes were plastered with mud. He was blind. He tried to turn the turret to look around. The electric motor hummed, but the turret didn't move. The gun barrel, stuck in the ground, worked like an anchor, blocking rotation. Hydraulics were powerless against a lever several meters long, pinned by tons of earth. They were trapped. In a steel coffin costing 117,000 Reichsmarks. 70 meters back, on the forest edge, Volkov lowered his binoculars. He wasn't smiling. An engineer doesn't smile when he sees a bridge collapse. He simply states a fact. The calculation is correct. You can't cheat structural mechanics. Inertia, he said quietly, addressing himself more than the crew. A terrible force if you don't know how to negotiate with it. For Volkov, this spectacle was the triumph of reason over brute power. The German tank wasn't destroyed by a shell. It didn't burn. It was defeated by its own mass. It was killed by its own weight, which German designers considered its protection. Thick armor, a powerful engine, a long gun. Volkov turned all these advantages around and used them against the enemy. This is tank aikido. Use the opponent's momentum so he destroys himself. The self-propelled Su-76 stood on solid ground. Its engines ran smoothly. Its crew was alive. And ahead, in the swamp, 45 tons of Third Reich ambitions were slowly sinking. Physics had finished its game. Now chemistry began. The chemistry of decomposition and rust. But before that, there would be one more act. The psychology of the doomed. The silence that follows the roar of a tank battle is scarier than the noise itself. It is unnatural. In the forest, birds don't sing, grasshoppers don't chirp. Every living thing froze, suppressed by the infernal noise that had just ceased. Only a sound remained resembling heavy, asthmatic breathing. It was the swamp breathing, digesting its prey. The German Panther no longer looked like a predator. Now it was just 45 tons of dead iron that had violated the laws of soil statics. It froze, nose dipped into the quagmire at a 30-degree angle. The barrel of the long gun, of which they were so proud, had gone into the slime up to the mantlet, like a spoon into thick sour cream. Now it wasn't a murder weapon. It was an anchor. A process began that engineers call soil consolidation, and soldiers call the death of a machine. The ground pressure of the Panther's tracks was almost 900 grams per square centimeter. This pressure exceeded the bearing capacity of the peat cushion by 3 times. Physics worked here without emotion, like a guillotine. Under the machine's weight, the soil structure collapsed. Water was displaced from the peat pores, and the tank began to sink. Not with a jerk, but smoothly, centimeter by centimeter. Inside the steel box, hell was happening now, invisible to anyone outside. The crew, concussed by the blow against the front armor, came to and realized their position. It smelled of spilled gasoline, blood, and swamp rot, which was already seeping inside through cracks and the emergency escape hatch in the floor. Volkov watched the enemy's agony through binoculars. He saw the Panther's commander cupola twitch. The hatch opened a couple of centimeters, but immediately slammed back. Apparently, the hull was twisted by the impact, and the lock jammed. Or, more likely, the heavy hatch cover simply wouldn't yield against gravity due to the angle of inclination. To open it, one had to push the weight up, overcoming gravity, and there was no footing. The floor was slipping away, the tank listing more and more. The driver and radio man sitting in the front hull were doomed first. Their hatches were on the upper glacis plate. Now this plate was already submerged in sludge. Above their heads was a ton of viscous mud. Opening the hatches was impossible. The hydrostatic pressure of the swamp pressed the steel flaps with a force of several hundred kilograms. They were walled in. They screamed, pounded the armor with fists, but this sound didn't escape. Thick German steel, created to keep shells out, now kept screams in. The Su-76M stood on solid ground 30 meters away. Engines ran smoothly. The exhaust was blue and calm. Gunner Saragin, young and hot, still kept his hand on the elevation handwheel. He shook from the adrenaline dump. "Comrade Lieutenant, permission to finish him off," he shouted, his voice breaking into a squeal. "Right in the side, under the turret, just to be sure." In the sight lay the perfect picture, the defenseless side of the German tank. The distance was spitting range. One 76mm armor-piercing shell would turn this sinking box into a bonfire right now. The ammo would detonate. The turret would blow off. It would be beautiful. It would be justice. Volkov slowly lowered his binoculars. His face, smeared with soot and oil, expressed nothing. Neither joy nor gloating. Only cold calculation. "Belay that." His voice sounded quiet, but in the silence of the cabin, it drowned out the engine noise. "Save the shells." "But he'll get away! He'll climb out!" Saragin was almost crying from tension. "He's not going anywhere." Volkov took out a cigarette and kneaded the tobacco. His engine took on water. Hydrostatic lock. Rods bent, block cracked, most likely. It's no longer a tank. It's real estate. And the crew? Volkov looked at the bubbles rising around the Panther's turret. Big, oily bubbles of swamp gas mixed with rainbow swirls of gasoline. The swamp smacked its lips, accepting the sacrifice. And the crew is already busy. They have their own war now, with water. Shooting at a sinking tank is wastefulness. A shell costs money. A shell is the labor of thousands of people in the rear. Spending it on what nature will do for free is a crime against logic. Besides, an ammo explosion could scatter burning debris for hundreds of meters, and we are standing on dry peat. We don't need a forest fire right now. The Panther settled deeper. Now the slime reached the base of the turret. Thick, black mass flooded the engine compartment. The hissing of hot metal cooling in water stopped. Only gurgling remained. Air escaped from the tank's internal cavities, making room for water. It looked like the last exhalation of a huge beast. Volkov knew what those inside were feeling. He was an engineer. He imagined the hull cross-section. Water entered through air intakes, through gaps in the gun mantlet. The level of black, icy sludge inside the fighting compartment rose quickly. Cold paralyzed movement. Panic burned up oxygen. It was a terrible death. Death in darkness, in confinement, under the pressure of 45 tons of one's own pride. But there was no pity. There was an understanding of the physics of the process. They came here in heavy machines, relying on force. Force killed them. The earth refused to hold them. "Loader, unload the gun," Volkov commanded. "Shell back in the rack." The sound of the clanging breech put a period on this battle. There was no shot. Victory was achieved not by gunpowder, but by mass and vector. The German machine had almost disappeared. Only the turret roof and the commander's periscope sticking up like a snail's eye remained on the surface. Then that vanished too. The swamp closed up. Green duckweed slowly, lazily covered the black hole left by the steel monster. In an hour, not even a trace would remain here. Only an oil slick would remind that a masterpiece of German tank building rested here. Volkov slapped the mechanic on the shoulder. The gesture was heavy, masterful. "Start her up, Grisha. Let's go. We still have work." The Gaz-203 engines howled, throwing out a cloud of smoke. The light, self-propelled gun, weighing just 11 tons, turned around on a dime. Its wide tracks laid softly on the ground, distributing weight so as not to disturb the fragile balance of the swamp. It didn't fight the terrain. It cooperated with it. They disappeared into the fog, dissolving into it as silently as they had appeared. Behind their backs remained silence, and a flat, beautiful clearing with bright green grass, under which, at a depth of 3 meters, in a steel crypt, 5 men remained forever, who believed armor was more important than intellect, and caliber more important than knowledge of geography. Volkov didn't look back. He thought about fuel, about track life, about the fact that mechanic Grigoriev performed a miracle by not tearing the transmission during the turn. That was important. And the sinking Panzer was already history, a statistic of Wehrmacht losses, a line in a report no one would read. The battle was over. Physics won. Death took its due without demanding a gram of TNT from the Soviet crew. This is the highest aerobatics of war. Destruction of the enemy without resource expenditure. Clean work. Ahead lay fog again, unknown again. But now the crew had something more than just orders. They had the understanding that even the most formidable force can be broken if you find the right fulcrum and remove it from under the enemy's feet in time. Evening of the same day. The sun, red and heavy, set behind the forest edge, flooding the battery position with thick, amber light. The air was cooling, but the smell of burning hadn't gone anywhere. It had become part of the landscape, like the craters filled with murky water. Lieutenant Viktor Volkov sat on an empty shell crate. In his hands was a rag soaked in diesel fuel. He methodically, finger by finger, wiped the grease ingrained in his skin. Around him in a semicircle sat the reinforcements. Young guys, yesterday's cadets, arrived with marching companies. They had clean tunics, unbroken boots, and eyes that read a mixture of fear and awe before the machinery. They looked at the Su-76M standing nearby. For them, this machine was a riddle. In training, they were told about firepower and maneuverability. But here, at the front, they had already managed to hear soldier folklore. The bare-assed Ferdinand. Goodbye, motherland. Crew's mass grave. These nicknames hit the psyche harder than German propaganda. They knew. Armor 15 millimeters. No roof. Gas tanks next to people. Chances of surviving an open fight against tigers and panthers trended toward 0. Volkov threw the dirty rag on the ground. He didn't make patriotic speeches. He didn't speak of duty. He was an engineer, and he would speak in the language of mechanics. Look here. Volkov's voice was quiet, hoarse from tobacco and command shouting. He took a dry twig and drew a diagram on the packed earth. Simple as a drawing of a nut. A square, that's us. A big rectangle, that's the German. Arrows, force vectors. Forget everything they taught you on the drill field, he said, poking the twig into the German rectangle. If you go against him head-on, you are corpses. Your armor is cardboard. It holds a bullet, but it doesn't hold a slug. The German gun stitches us through from 1.5 kilometers. We him, only from 500 meters, and that's if we're lucky enough to hit a weak spot. The young ones were silent. Someone swallowed nervously. This was the hard truth they didn't write in newspapers. "Does that mean we are suicide squads?" asked one of the fighters, just a boy with sticking out ears. Volkov looked up at him. The lieutenant's eyes were light, cold as a winter sky. "It means you must be smarter," he answered. "The German is strong. He has a thick hide and a long club. But he is heavy. Remember this word, heavy." Volkov drew a thick line under the rectangle. 45 tons, he wrote on the ground. Or 56 if it's a tiger. This is their strength, but this is also their death. The heavier the cupboard, the louder it falls. And the harder it is for it to turn. He began to explain the principle that would later be called tank aikido in the regiment, using the enemy's inertia against him. Volkov broke the battle down into physical components, like disassembling a gun breech. "You must not take the blow," he continued, drawing flanking arcs. "You must let it pass you by. Your task is not to pierce the armor, but to break the will of the enemy machine commander. Force him to twitch. Force him to make unnecessary movements." He explained the peculiarities of German tank transmissions, told about the interleaved suspension that clogged with mud, that the Panther's turret electric drive depended on engine RPMs. If you force the German to drop gas, his turret will rotate slowly, like the millstone of an old mill. "We are light cavalry," said Volkov. 11 tons. We can pass where the German sits on his belly. Use the ground, swamp, sand, steep slope. This is your armor. Not steel saves you, but geography. Lure him into an awkward place. Let him fight the earth, not you. He drew the diagram of today's battle, the turn angle, the inertia vector, the point of track slippage. This wasn't a story about a feat. It was a technical incident analysis. "I didn't shoot," said Volkov, looking at the diagram. "I just let him accelerate. He killed himself, with his own greed and his own mass." The young gunners listened with bated breath. A paradigm shift was happening in their heads. They stopped seeing their machine as an iron coffin. They began to see it as a tool. A dangerous, complex, demanding, but effective tool. A scalpel. "The driver mechanic is the main man in the crew." Volkov nodded toward Grigoriev, who was sleeping right there by the track, covered with a quilted jacket. "Whether you live or burn depends on his hands and feet. The gunner can miss. You have a second shell. The mechanic cannot mistake." He has no second attempt. Volkov erased the drawing on the ground with his boot. Don't look for trouble, he summarized. Fight with your head. Count the seconds. Listen to the engine. Feel the ground with your ass. If you think faster than the German turret turns, you will return home. The lesson was over. No applause, no questions. Only the heavy realization that war is work. Dirty, hard work, where knowledge of physics is more important than courage. This philosophy of Volkov's spread through the battery like ripples on water. The Volkov school became the unspoken standard. Newcomers stopped fearing the open cabin. They learned to listen to the forest, learned to distinguish the sound of engines, learned to use maneuver instead of frontal attack. In subsequent battles, the regiment would suffer losses. This is war. People get killed here. But the crews who went through these evening sit-downs by the shell crates would survive where others perished. They would drive Tigers onto weak bridges that collapsed under their weight. They would shoot Ferdinands in the sides, approaching from downwind so the wind carried away the noise of their own engines. They would turn the disadvantages of their light cardboard equipment into deadly traps for the heavy, clumsy monsters of the Wehrmacht. Volkov stood up, brushing off his trousers. "All right, lights out," he threw out. "Tomorrow wake up at 0400. Track tension check. If I see slack of more than a centimeter on anyone, I'll skin you myself." He walked away into the darkness toward his tent. A lonely, stooped figure of a man carrying the weight of responsibility for these boyish lives on his shoulders. He wasn't a hero. He was simply a master of his craft. A master teaching survival in the death zone, using Newton's laws like a prayer. And this lesson, drawn with a twig on the dirty Belarusian earth, many sitting here would remember for a lifetime. A life given to them by this knowledge. Spring, 1945, Germany, outskirts of Berlin. Red brick dust hung in the air. It clogged nostrils, crunched on teeth, covered the armor of machines with an even, matte layer. This was no longer the smell of rotten Belarusian swamps. It was the smell of burning stone and a ruined empire. Guards Captain Viktor Volkov stood leaning his elbow on the cabin of his Su-76M. On the side of the machine, over peeling green paint, the number and guard's badge were painted in white lead. This bitch had gone halfway across Europe with him. She changed tracks, engines, barrels, but remained the same light box open to all winds, in which the crew's life depends not on steel thickness, but on neuron reaction speed. The war was ending. It was felt in everything. In the unnatural silence of pauses between artillery barrages, in the behavior of prisoners walking in columns, looking at the ground, in the feeling of the finish line, to which only a few steps remained. Volkov survived. This was a statistical anomaly. A light gun commander who started his combat path in 43 had an estimated survival time in battle of 3 attacks. Volkov survived hundreds. He survived duels with Tigers near Warsaw, ambushes in Pomerania, the breakthrough of the defense line on the Oder. He became a grand master of motor war. He learned to feel shell trajectories with his skin. He turned his vulnerable machine into an instrument of absolute efficiency. He took off his headset. His hair was gray. He wasn't even 30, but his face was lined with wrinkles into which soot had eaten. He looked at the map. Ahead, an intersection blocked by debris from a collapsed building. Beyond, a straight road to the city center. Fate isn't a lady with scales. Fate in war is probability theory multiplied by ballistics. And this theory has a wicked sense of humor. Death did not come in the form of an 88mm shell from a King Tiger. Death did not come from a Panzerfaust striking the side with a cumulative jet. Death came as a stupid, blind accident. Somewhere 3 blocks away, in the ruins, a German Volkssturm member, an old man or a teenager, pulled the mortar cord in panic. He didn't see the target. He just fired toward the Russians. An 81mm mortar shell described a high parabola. It flew tumbling, contrary to the laws of aerodynamics. It was a stray shot, the garbage of war. Volkov at that moment was explaining to a young driver mechanic how to properly pass rubble so as not to throw an idler wheel. "Don't gas on bricks," he said calmly. "A brick is like a bearing. The track slides on it." The shell fell 10 meters away, into a soft pile of sand and plaster. The explosion was barely audible, just a dull pop, as if a bag had burst. A single fragment, a jagged piece of cast iron, the size of a finger joint. It had kinetic energy sufficient to punch through a quilted jacket, a tunic, and a rib cage. Its flight vector intersected with Captain Volkov's life vector at one point in space and time. Volkov fell silent mid-sentence. He didn't fall dramatically. He just slumped, slowly sliding down the armor of his machine. There was no pain on his face. There was surprise. The surprise of an engineer who had calculated the most complex equations of battle all war long, but didn't account for a simple variable of chaos. The crew froze. Grigoriev, who had gone with him from Bobruisk to Berlin, caught the commander. "Comrade Captain! Vitya!" But physiology is irreversible. The fragment severed an artery. The heart, which withstood the G-forces of tank duels, stopped in seconds. Blood soaked into the gray German dust. Volkov died a week before victory. The man who outplayed panthers and outsmarted physics in the swamps was killed by blind chance. There is no higher meaning in this. It's just war, a dirty lottery where a winning ticket can be voided at any moment. But the death of a man is not the death of an idea. 2 days later, streets of Berlin, the hell of a stone sack. Tanks burned on narrow avenues, Panzerfausts struck from roofs and basements. Heavy IS-2 tanks, clumsy in the tight space, became easy targets. Their powerful armor didn't save them from strikes from above, but amidst smoke and fire scuttled nimble shadows, Su-76M. They didn't go onto main streets. They went through courtyards, through breaches in walls, using tactics not in the manuals. A young lieutenant, Volkov's student, commanded his machine. He saw a barricade ahead, behind which the silhouette of a Jagdpanther tank destroyer could be guessed. A frontal attack was impossible, fatal. The lieutenant remembered Volkov's voice. "Don't hit head-on. Use inertia. Use the terrain." "Mechanic, back!" he shouted. "Into the archway!" The machine sharply reversed, hiding in a dark passage a second before a German slug blew apart the corner of the house where they had just stood. The German gunner lost the target. He started to get nervous. He turned the casemate, trying to find the enemy, and the Soviet gun was already popping out from the other side, from a parallel alley. It approached the German strictly from the side. Distance, 50 meters. "Fire!" 76 millimeters of steel and explosives hit the side, where shells lay behind the armor. The explosion blew the roof off the German casemate. This was Volkov's handwriting. This was his tank aikido. Not force against force, but maneuver against statics, intellect against mass. The whole battery fought Volkov style. They didn't lose machines, they saved men. They knew. Heroism isn't dying beautifully, but completing the mission and surviving. They heard his voice in the engine noise. "Our armor is cardboard. Use your heads." May 1945. The Reichstag was taken. Silence covered Europe.
It rang in the ears. On one of the columns of the Brandenburg Gate, among thousands of inscriptions in charcoal and chalk, appeared one made hastily with a piece of burnt brick. Volkov's students were here. Bobruisk, Berlin. Physics works. This inscription would be washed away by rains. The Su-76 would be sent for smelting. The country needed metal for reconstruction. The swamps near Bobruisk would heal the track marks. Rust would eat the Panther drowned in '44. But the memory of the master would remain. It would remain not in the granite of monuments, but in the reflexes of those who survived. In the understanding that war isn't parades and orchestras.
It is hard black work, where the winner isn't the one with the bigger caliber, but the one who knows how to count, wait, and use the laws of this world to their advantage. Viktor Volkov didn't live to see the fireworks. His body lies in a mass grave near Berlin, under a simple plywood star. But his science saved hundreds of lives. Iron doesn't win. Iron is dead. The man who controls the iron wins. The man who knows that even 45 tons of lethal steel are powerless before 11 tons of pure, cold calculation. In the end, inertia is dampened by friction. But memory has no mass. It is eternal.